The rise of totalitarianism in Germany, 1921 to 1938. The introduction to totalitarianism defined and explained its development after World War I. Totalitarianism is a social system which attempts to control the daily lives of individuals. It focuses on the militarization of society. Totalitarian societies have a mystical leader, a Führer. It's made possible by the mass media and industrialized warfare. On the political spectrum, totalitarianism falls on the far right and the far left. In the middle are republics. Republics base their system on representative government. Voters go to the polls, they select their leaders, those leaders then respond to public pressure. In a totalitarian society, however, the leaders treat their entire society as a military unit. They are the commander-in-chief. Everyone else will follow orders. In the previous lecture, we looked at the development of communism and saw how the communists in the USSR implemented Marxism, implemented materialism, sponsored a workers' revolution, sought to achieve the goals of socialism. The communists achieved their control of a country first. They were out front. At the end of World War I, they seized control of the Soviet Union and established their society. On the far right, however, were the fascists. Fascists reacted to or responded to the developments of communism. The fascists focused on heritage, spiritualization, middle-class stability, capitalism. There are multiple examples in Europe, but we're going to focus on Hitler's Third Reich. Unlike the republics that favored toleration, debate, compromise, totalitarian systems favored violence in search of purity. They wanted no deviations from the orders of their leader. This lecture will focus on the development from Weimar to Hitler, the Nazis' rise to power, and the Third Reich. The Weimar Republic replaced the Bismarckian Reich at the end of World War I. The Bismarckian Reich was the Second Reich. The Holy Roman Empire was the First Reich. It fell to Napoleon in 1804. The Second Reich, the Bismarckian Reich, fell to the Allies in World War I. The Weimar Republic modified their constitution to look more like the Western republics in the United States and France. It was a respublica, a public thing. It belonged to the people, not to the Kaiser. The position of monarch was eliminated. The Kaiser, the Caesar, the Emperor, gone. The Bundesrat, the upper house of parliament, was eliminated. The Bundesrat had represented the princes of the Reich. Since there were no longer any princes in a republic, that house was simply eliminated. Rising in stature then was the Reichstag, the representative assembly, equivalent to the British Parliament or the National Assembly in France. That body drew its support from voters. There were multi-party elections. There was freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. Voters were free to speak their mind and choose their representatives. The Reichstag then selected the Chancellor. The majority party in the Reichstag had the right or the authority to form a government. As long as the Chancellor maintained the support of the Reichstag, the Chancellor could govern the country. The Reichstag also gained control of the military through budgeting, through the power of the purse. The framers of the Weimar Republic decided that the country needed a unifying figurehead, that the voters should be able to elect a president as a figurehead, as a unifying force for the country. He oversaw ceremonies, he greeted foreign ambassadors, he spoke on public occasions. The president was the face of the nation. The transition from a Reich to a republic was very rough and a painful experience. The first order of business was to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles placed all responsibility for World War I on Germany and its allies. The Allied powers, especially Serbia, took no responsibility for what happened in the war. This allowed the Allies to punish Germany severely, especially through reparations. When Germany failed in those reparation payments, France tried to extract reparations with the invasion of the Ruhr. This was a humiliating defeat for the young Republic. The only way out was for the Republic to make peace with its enemies. German conservatives, however, were not so tolerant of the Republic itself. Conservatives like Friedrich Jünger blamed Germany's problems on the weakness of the Republic itself. They took no responsibility for the run-up to the war, the conduct of the war, or the loss in the war. German conservatives simply blamed the Weimar Republic and the socialist in charge for all of Germany's problems. Jünger described his position in The Rise of the New Nationalism, 1926. Listen how Jünger describes the birth of the Weimar Republic. The November Revolution was the result of a moral collapse, promoted by external pressures. It happened at a time when the frightful struggle of war should have demanded the concentration of all enemies. Rightfully, it was called a stab in the back, because it was led by Germans against Germans, provocatively and from the rear. The revolution proved the shallowness of its promoters. They could not radiate youth, warmth, energy, or greatness. They were deputies, but no leaders. There was no man among them who stood out by his exceptional qualities. We saw the feeble liberals and heard for the 100th time the promulgation of human rights. One might say a dusty storeroom was thrown open, from which emerged human rights, freedom, toleration, parliament, suffrage, and popular representation. Finally, they wrote a liberalist novel, The Weimar Republic. German conservatives then blamed the loss in the war on the revolutions that brought an end to the Kaiser's regime. They took no account of the reality that the German army lost on the battlefield because it was simply overwhelmed by Allied forces. Instead, conservatives like Jünger blamed liberals and liberal ideas for weakening the nation provocatively and from behind. It was a stab in the back. What was Jünger's solution? Jünger called on a new nationalism. Listen to how he describes that new nationalism. The new nationalism wants to awaken a sense of the German past. Life must be evaluated according to the will to power, which reveals the warlike character of all life. The value of the individual is assessed according to his military value to the state. The state is recognized as the most creative and toughest source of power. It is necessary to look at the conditions that have preceded and created the new nationalism. The recent past has destroyed our inherent collective sense of tender intimacy by trying to subvert and weaken all the close bonds of community. It has denied all the values that created cohesion in the community. Everything conspired to speed the disintegration of human ties in state, church, marriage, family, and many other institutions. A mad urge for throwing off all restraints, for the dissolution, for unbridled liberty, dissolved society into driftwood. This urge shaped the flighty masses, depriving them of all convictions of meaningfulness. These excesses finally aroused disgust, and a counter-movement arose. A new consolidation of purpose began. From it arises the future success of the new nationalism, its resistance to the atomistic liberty and to the freedom of the soulless decadence. Social life is never free. A mighty mysterious bond of blood links the lives and subsumes them to a fateful wholeness. Blood, as it were, sings the song of destiny. German conservatives then longed for the days of old. They wanted a restoration of power. No more talk, no more compromise. Life is war. Compromise invites death. The liberal Weimar Republic embodied everything that German conservatives hated. They hated talk, they hated compromise, they hated debate, they hated freedom. They sought the militarization of life. During the early 1920s, they had little success getting their message through. They were able to recruit young army veterans, like a young Austrian named Adolf Hitler. Well, who was he? Much is made that Adolf Hitler was an Austrian, which is true. He was born on the Austrian side of the German-Austrian border. But if you look at the map on the left, you'll see that Austria was a Germanic people. Austria was a political organization, not a national organization or an ethnic group. The ethnicity, the nation, were Germans. Bismarck had excluded or pushed out the Austrians because they had looked east. Adolf Hitler saw his Austrian country in the beginning of World War I and saw it as a mongrel state made up of Hungarians and Slavs and Yugoslavs. That Austro-Hungarian state for him was a disgrace. He looked to the Bismarckian right for greatness. And so when given the opportunity at the beginning of the war, Adolf Hitler joined. He was a German army veteran. He saw himself as German. Austria was simply a state, and the Austrian state needed to be united with the rest of the German nation, and the Bismarckian Reich was where that was going to happen. That was his goal. Like millions of veterans at the end of World War I, he found himself adrift. He had no meaning or purpose because he had no place in the Weimar Republic. But because of the threat of Bolshevism, because of the threat of a Marxist rebellion, the German socialists teamed up with German conservatives in the judiciary and in the executive branch to try to hunt down the most radical elements of the Marxist movement. And so they recruited people like Adolf Hitler, who became an internal spy. He tried to infiltrate, and he did infiltrate, radical groups. His most success came with the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This was a left-wing organization. At the time, it had 77 members, but it was not a real threat. And so Adolf Hitler joined its membership, listened to its message, and decided that he could do a better job of leading the group. When he did, he transformed this organization from a left-wing organization to a right-wing organization. He changed the name of the party from the National Socialist German Workers' Party to the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party. And in the process, he adopted all of the symbols of the left-wing movement, the word socialist, the color red, in order to promote a German conservative agenda. Under his leadership, the Nazi Party grew from 77 to 60,000 men. It dressed up in uniforms. It pretended to be a paramilitary force. They saw German greatness not in debate, not in discussion, but with blood and iron. Their first opportunity to make a difference happened with the beer hall push in 1923. They saw the government in Munich and Bavaria as weak, and so they rose up in rebellion. It was a miserable failure. As soon as the first shots were fired, Adolf Hitler ran and hid. The state hunted him down as a criminal, arrested him, tried him, and threw him in jail. Communists in another part of Germany had also rose in rebellion. Those communists were executed. Conservative rebels like Adolf Hitler were not seen as a threat to the state. They simply were misguided. They could be rehabilitated. Communists, on the other hand, were a threat to the entire community and had to be eliminated. Adolf Hitler went to prison. There he had a cook, a dog, and also a secretary. At this time, he decided He would no longer pursue a military campaign against the Reich. He would try to convince German voters.